Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Renaissance Builder. Hey, how you doing? Hi, everybody. How you doing tonight? So, this video is going to be a little different than my usual. So, a little less entertaining, but here's the idea. I did a review video, or sort of a review video. We talked about, the motherboard in this computer. So here's the computer. It's done. It's working. It's powering the two monitors. I've been editing on it, and everything's working out pretty good. I did have troubles loading Windows. Turns out I burned, like straight up burned up one zip drive, booting Windows up onto this thing. And then another zip drive. So I mean, there were some errors here and there. I ended up having to buy a key to get it to load right. So that was a thing, but I'm already off track. Really what I want to talk about is I feel like I did a very, very poor job of representing the equipment we actually have in this computer. So I thought, you know what, let's backtrack and talk about it, right? The computer works great. There are some things that I should mention that's not uncommon already. Like, this is not latest and greatest hardware, so all the issues that I have are already known about in the industry, so maybe some of you guys already know these. But I actually took notes down so that I could make this video and put my best foot forward representing what this really is, because this is high-end equipment. Whether you guys want to argue about Intel being high-end or whatever nowadays, you can suck it. It's still the fastest chip. A 9900K is still faster than any of your Ryzen chips. Like, just get over it already. Like, I'm not going to argue that Ryzen sure does better core management, but if all you're doing is gaming, the Intel's still faster. Whatever, you want to eat your salty wheat, go for it. Anyhow, besides that, this equipment is high-end equipment. So I wanted to do a video representing this equipment. So, that's what we're going to do. Now, first off, I think I should start with the motherboard, because we already talked about the motherboard, so I'm not going to talk about, what we already did. This is not a redo of that video. I want to name specifics, like what makes this motherboard special compared to other motherboards. And first off, there's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison that we can use. This motherboard is a small form factor motherboard, but it's slightly bigger than a normal small form factor motherboard. It's not mini or micro, it's mini D. There's like a whole other little separate category for it. I don't know, it's different, but it's slightly bigger than the smallest. Like my junk board over here is smaller form factor than this one is. So apples to apples, we're just gonna say in the small form factor category of motherboards, this holds the world records. So the ASUS ROG MAXIMUS 11 Gene Z390 chipset. Z390 chipset stands for the particular chip that does the integration for the Intel 9900K. It's the latest, so far, the latest iteration of Intel's chips that it needs to do the talking with their other chips, CPUs. It's a lot of chips. So that's what the Z390 stands for. The rest of it is just ASUS terminology of this is a fancy motherboard. There is illumination on this motherboard. There are LEDs scattered hither and yon. There's a couple here, but I really don't think it's not gaudy too much. It really isn't. In fact, I would probably say I could even go for some more, like a little digital interface. Some motherboards have a little digital interface on there. It's snazzy. I would kind of like that, but whatever. It's not overdone in the illumination. It really isn't. So let's talk about the specs of the motherboard. For starters, it holds world records. So Der Bauer, which is a gentleman in Germany, if you couldn't tell by the name, holds the record overclocking with the 9900K, which this has, this same setup, well, the same CPU and motherboard. He managed to get that overclock to 7.9, so 7.9 mega, 7,900 megahertz. I could not get that out. I don't know why. Almost 8 gigahertz on the 9900K. Of course, this is liquid nitrogen cooling. Now, why is that significant? This is small form factor. That's a lot of power and a lot of speed chugging out. And again, I know, as far as overclocking goes, I have to do a video on what overclocking is and what it means. It'll be a quick video, but I'll go over that. But let it be known, this motherboard itself holds records as far as overclocking abilities. But that's because it was specifically engineered for liquid nitrogen cooling. Liquid nitrogen being negative like 280 degrees or negative 290 degrees or something like that. Stupid cold. Like, it is literally the coldest you're going to conveniently get it. Like, liquid helium is colder, but good luck getting that stuff kind of thing. Liquid nitrogen is actually pretty common, so, you know, that's doable. So, yeah, this thing holds records. It's quite a powerhouse. So let's go over some of the things that are different on this motherboard, and which are actually why I chose this motherboard. I plan on subcooling, doing sub-ambient cooling, negative 20 degrees. I want this computer to run at a constant or consistent negative 20 degrees with the cooling loop. So that's well below sub-ambient. That's freezing on top of some. But I wanted a motherboard that was geared for that. Whatever cold bugs are there, it has fixes for that. Whatever power monitoring or anything I need, it has that. So that's why I wanted this motherboard specifically. So some of the features it has. There's a jumper in here for LN2 mode. That jumper presets a bunch of settings on the motherboard in the firmware to make liquid nitrogen cooling more convenient. It takes care of, they call it a cold boot bug, which I guess is when you get the CPU so cold, it doesn't like to boot up, so it changes the voltages around. So when you put that in L2 mode, it's supposed to take care of that cold boot bug. There is a slow boot switch. In other words, if I am not booting correctly, I can hit a switch. Like if it's just having a hard time booting, I can hit a switch in there that it puts it in slow boot, which basically changes the voltages on the CPU until it gets running and then sticks it back to your hardcore overclock. Because, well, I'll do a video on that. So there's a slow boot switch, which again is in case you are running super cold and you're super overclocked and it's just not quite catching on the boot up, then that would help you out. There's a safe boot button. Now, normally you'd have to hit, to do safe boot, you'd have to hit F11, I think. I could be wrong. Or reset, not reset, delete. You just hit your delete button for a while and it sticks you into BIOS and then you can go to safe boot. So normally you'd have to do safe boot from the keyboard, but in this case, because overclocking requires rebooting the motherboard so often, and sometimes, well, often, you corrupt the program, like it won't boot correctly on your settings. So you can hit this button and it will automatically, without any input, boot into safe mode, which uses preset settings to make sure that the motherboard is going to boot up correctly. And then you can go back into the BIOS from there and change your settings to see if you can't fix what you broke in the first place. So it's a manual button to say, oh, I need safe mode. Let's reset that right off the get-go. there is another one that's called a retry button. It's not reset, it's retry, which means instead of, like say you made some adjustments and the thing just completely fails to respond. And I'll be honest with you, in my case, that normally resulted in a pulling the plug. And the computers don't like that when you do that. It's not a good scene. But anyway, so don't do that, by the way, to your computer. Don't ever just pull the plug because it's not working. It's not a good thing. But the retry switch means as it's booting up and it fails to completely boot, so it's non-responsive, just completely non-responsive. The reset switch doesn't work. The retry switch forces it to boot again. It simply just retries the boot sequence. I guess that's a thing where if you do it enough times, it might catch. Like apparently that's a thing in the whole overclocking scene, so it's convenient. From what I understand, it's very convenient. Those are some basic like hardware-based functions that they put into this to make the whole overclocking procedure significantly more convenient. On top of that, they have inputs for a thermal sensor. So I can put a thermal sensor somewhere on this, whether I want to monitor the CPU block, or the case temperature, or whatever I want to. I can put a thermal sensor in there and then assign that thermal sensor a name and monitor it in the software. On top of that, they have inputs for both water temperature in and out of the CPU block, as well as water flow. So from the software, I can straight up monitor what the cooling system is doing at the CPU. Now, mind you, I am going to make a system for the cooling loop that is self-contained, because at negative 20 degrees, I need to operate circulators, I need to operate compressors and EXVs, and I need to operate a cooling system, not just a radiator. It gets complicated. So I have to build a controller for that, and that controller is going to be independent. So it's not software-based type of thing, because you want that more reliable than just software. So it's going to be independent, and it will also have its own sensors and everything to monitor temperatures. But it is nice to know that I can straight up put the sensors on the CPU block and monitor what the water cooling at the CPU is doing. That is a good thing to know. On top of that, they add they call it a Pro Belt. It's a series of terminals on the motherboard that I can measure with a VMM, or a digital voltmeter. I can measure the voltages that the motherboard's running at, whether it be the CPU voltages, the memory voltages, that kind of stuff. So there is a terminal series in there specifically for the point of measuring voltages with a reliable voltage measuring device, not just software. Software is not that reliable. This software is more reliable than others. ASUS uses higher quality parts and software to monitor voltages and stuff in their equipment, but using a digital voltmeter is hands down much more reliable than the software that they use. So that's another added feature. Unfortunately, to use that, I have to solder wires or connectors onto the board, which then completely eliminates the warranty. So I'm not going to do that until I know it's necessary, because it's not a cheap motherboard either. So that's some of the stuff. Now, the goodies, like the hardware goodies. One of a motherboard's biggest jobs is to supply power to the CPU. And that's done through what's called a VRM, or a voltage regulation module. Now, ASUS advertises this board as a 10-phase voltage regulation module. 10-phase meaning there's 10 channels or 10 switch clusters to input voltages. So I can turn those switch clusters on and off. I can adjust how fast those switch clusters are turning on and off to regulate the voltages. It's a 10-phase VRM is supposed to be very stable. But there's a caveat. It's not a 10-phase. Now, I'm not an electrical engineer, so I'm going to tell you, if you want to know what I'm talking about very specifically, then I suggest going to actually hardcore overclocking. Yeah, I think that's the channel, where he does a very great review, and he breaks it down by the chip numbers. Like literally takes a picture of the motherboard, looks up the chip numbers. Oh, this is the chip they're using to control. So essentially I have a switching cluster that is a couple switches in there, transistors really, to put it simply, that is turning on and off very quickly, taking a 5-volt signal and turning it into like 1.25 volts, right? So it's just switching very fast. I have 10 of those, right? So if I want to control 10 of those individually, then I need a chip, another chip, a controller that can individually tell each one of those to do their own thing. The controller chip they decided to use can't do that. It can only do at most 8. So what they've done is they're running it in 5+2, and what that means is it's operating like a 5-phase. So each signal coming off that control chip is controlling 2 VRM switch packets. And that's put it in layman's terms. That's put it as, it's not technically accurate. I'm not an electrical engineer. That's layman's terms. But this VRM, however, it being a 5-phase is not a bad thing. They have built up the inductors and the capacitance to make up for what could be a stuttery 5-phase. Instead, the phases are not only out of sequence, so when you have the 2 running on that one signal, they're a bit out of sequence so that they don't hammer the current at the same time. So that levels it off a bit. But between the inductors and the capacitors that they've built into this VRM, you don't get, when one turns on and then another one turns on, you don't get the surging and the fall off that you normally would see from a cheap 5-phase VRM. Also, using 10 well, they're not 10 phases, but using 10 channels, they're also able to divide the current load up between significantly more chips, meaning the efficiency is higher, is a lot higher. The efficiency being how much current am I pushing versus how much heat am I generating. Heat being wasted energy. The more heat you produce, the less efficient the package is. So by dividing up the current across more switches, then I can be more efficient because I'm producing less heat. The switches are having to do, they're not working nearly as hard to get the job done. That being said, this VRM, each individual switching chip in this VRM is capable of 60 amps. That's what it's rated for. There's 10 of them. So there is a theoretical limit to this VRM of 600 amps. Now, you're not going to push 600 amps through the chip. You're probably not even going to push 300 amps through the chip. But fact is, this VRM can do it. And what that means is it's incredibly solid. You are never, with a 9900K, and unfortunately, the new chip that is the 10900K, which is faster and more power hungry, uses a different socket so it doesn't fit this motherboard. So the most you're going to get to in this motherboard is the 9900K. Unfortunately, that's the case. But that chip, you're never going to really push it that ungodly far. In fact, I may, by the time we're all said and done, if all the stars line up and everything works out great, I may be overclocking this to the point where I'm actually using that VRM for what it's worth, and that might be 300, 350 watts amps out of there. 300, it's like 1.4 volts. So at 300 amps, that's three and a half. So that's 150. So 450 watts maybe 500 watts. I don't know if I'll push it that, I don't know if I'll end up pushing it that hard, but it's hard to get a, it's hard to look up specs when you start talking overclocking. I can give you specs on standard operation. Like I believe they advertise the chip at 125 TDP. So that's, 125 watts worth of heat that this thing will give off under normal load. That's at clocked at 3.6 hertz, 3.6 gigahertz. So, that's standard. But once you get into overclocking, it's hard to get specs because whilst people are measuring that, it's more of a race. The overclocking thing is more of a race, not a, hey, this is what you're going to do when you get to there kind of thing. Regardless, this board is capable of doing that. So the VRM is stout. It's literally the strongest VRM in a small form factor board on the market to date. I'm sure there'll be a new one eventually, but for now, that's what we got. And that was done on purpose. That's really all these things coupled together is why I wanted this board for this project. Also, there's the added benefits. The board is capable, or at least it says it's capable, ASUS says it's capable of running memory at 4800 megahertz. Megahertz or gigahertz? I think it's megahertz. Megabytes. 4800 megabytes. That is right? Because this stuff is faster. This is 4400. Well, anyhow, you know what? So this can run the memory at 4800. The motherboard is good for that. I couldn't afford 4800. The fastest I got is 4400. And here's the thing. The faster memory you get, the more expensive it gets. So my 4400 megahertz is 16 gigs. 4400 at 18 case latency. The case latency is kind of like how many cycles it takes for it to get the job done, whereas the speed is like, I guess, latency is how long it takes to start the job, and the speed is how fast it can actually get the job done, kind of thing. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like I said, I'm not an electrical engineer, but I think that's how it works. My 32 gig set, which is in here, is only 3200, which is still plenty fast. And, again, overclockable. So, I'm pretty sure that's the kit we're going to stick with. But when we start spooling this thing up and making it faster, I do have faster RAM available to put in here. I'm not so much worried about the 32 gigs. I have yet to max out my RAM doing stuff. Like, I really don't I don't hit RAM all that hard. So, we'll see. I think 16 gigs would probably be fine, especially if I'm spooling the computer up to run so much faster. So, anyhow, it is capable of running some seriously fast RAM. So that's a thing. What else? What else do we got on the motherboard? Oh, the DIMM.2 slot. So ASUS is... I don't think ASUS is the only one manufacturer using the DIMM.2 slot, but here's what happens with the DIMM.2 slot. For one, it gives us mountable, 2 extra mountable NVMe drives. Those NVMe drives are using each one of those NVMe drives are using 4 lanes of the CPU, I'm going to call it integration. I'm not laying it right, but each CPU has so many lanes that it can talk through. And the DIMM.2 allows us to use 8 of those lanes. The other lanes are going to be assigned to the primary PCIe slot, and then through the chipset. Then it talks to the chipset, which then talks to the rest of the slots. So all your expansion slots and stuff go through the chipset. All your SATA lanes, all your SATA inputs go through the chipset. All your board-mounted hard drives, the drives that are mounted on the board itself, they also go through the chipset. The chipset is just an added, it's like a third party, so it slows things down a little bit. The DIMM.2 avoids the chipset and gives us 8 total lanes of NVMe straight to the CPU. Here's what that amounts to. Assuming you guys have a solid state drive in your computer, which is already significantly faster than a normal spinning disk hard drive. But assuming you have a solid state drive with a SATA cable. I probably should have one up here, but a SATA cable is the communication cable that goes between the hard drive and the motherboard, or like your DVD drive and the motherboard, that kind of thing. You have to power the unit, and then you have to talk to the motherboard through a cable. So that's a SATA cable. NVMe drives don't use SATA cables, so they're not limited by the speed that a SATA cable can run through. That's the limiting factor, is the cable can only transfer data but so fast. NVMe drives are not limited by that, so they're already naturally significantly faster, on top of using different chipsets to do communication and the memory and all that kind of stuff. Couple that with the fact that it's talking directly to the CPU with 4 lanes each. If there is a way to set up those 2 drives that's RAID 0, and the RAID is just a setting, that the computer talks to both of them at the same time. And since they don't share channels, then talking to both of them essentially doubles your read and write speeds across what is now one hard drive. When you set it RAID 0, it's essentially one hard drive. If one fails, you lose all your data. Like you're screwed in RAID 0. But it does double that. So I just jotted down some figures that I found. The standard, I have the 970EVOPLUS. And the 970EVOPLUS is already 7 times faster than your standard solid state drive via SATA cable, because you're limited by the SATA cable. So one of those drives is already 7 times faster. We're talking read and write speeds of over 3,000 megabytes. That's just as fast as the RAM. It's literally just as fast as the RAM. And on top of that, if I go to the extent of setting up the RAID the way I can double it, then I'm running faster than the RAM. My hard drives are running faster than the RAM. Like, let that sink in. What? That is nuts. But yeah, so you could essentially, if everything is set up right and running in a perfect world, you could have the DIMM.2 NVMe's hard drives running 14 times faster than a standard solid state drive on a SATA cable. I think that's pretty significant. And on top of that, if you watch the whole build log thing, I don't gotta run wires. I don't have to run a SATA cable. I don't have to run a power cable to any of the hard drives. They're on the motherboard. So, done with it. I think it cleans it up quite nicely. That's just my opinion of it. So, we talked about the DIMM.2, we talked about the RAM, that's the motherboard. The processor, 9900K, we mentioned that. It's still the fastest processor domestically on the market. So, you know, Ryzen is a good chip, but Intel's still the fastest. And on top of that, I could not get nearly as solid a motherboard for a Ryzen processor. So, you know, if I'm going negative 20 degrees, this is the one I want. Yeah, so we talked about the RAM. That leads me into the video card. Now, this video card, there's quite a bit going on. So I decided, instead of trying to write everything down, I would put it on the screen. And of course, the screen turned off. So just going to boot in here. So this video card is significant. It's the 2080 Ti, the GeForce RTX 2080 Ti. Now, you might be asking yourself, why in the world did I need a 2080 Ti? If you're going to do something, if you're already this far into the game, just go for it. I mean, there's no sense in stunting yourself when you're already this far into the game. And what I mean by stunting myself, I could have put a lesser card in here for lesser money. However, the 8-core processor, well, actually, let's just talk about a comparison, right? So my old computer is an 8-core processor, and I give that air quotes because it's not actually a true 8, well, it is 8 cores, but it's not 8 individual cores. Every 2 cores has to share a cache, which is essentially like a short-term memory for that chip, which limits it down to only 4 cores at a time. So it's like, oh, it's an 8-core processor, but we can only run 4 cores at a time. The 9900K is an 8-core processor, which can run 16 threads. That means each core can do 2 things at a time. So it virtually looks like a 16-core processor. I say virtually because it's, you know, a software thing. When I do the video editing using Adobe Elements, not Premiere Pro, it's Elements, so it's the cut down version. I can't afford, nor do I intend to pay a monthly subscription for a stupid editing program. But by the time, that's what I'm using. And Adobe is a CPU-based program. So if I wanted to render a video on the old computer, it took over 2 hours. This computer, it's 30 minutes. The same video. I was going to do, you know, a demonstration on here, but you know what? It's going to waste time, and you guys don't want to waste that much time. So, it's 400% faster. I like using percentages. It sounds like a bigger number. 400% faster. It's 4 times faster than the old computer, but it's only hardware based. It's only CPU based. So it's doing all the work with the CPU, which then hammers the CPU and limits the computer. If I stuck with that, then yes, the 2080 Ti is wasted. But that's not what I'm going to do. The 2080 Ti has 2 things that is its reason for being so expensive, I guess is what I'm going to call it. One, RTX cores. Now, what are RTX cores? You have to understand that video cards have hardware-based cores for video editing, meaning the transistors in the video card are not arranged the same way as the transistors in the CPU. The transistors in a video card are arranged to take specific signals that are video signals and process them in a different manner. The standard manner of video processing could only do static, if I'm not mistaken, it could only do static representation. Like when movie theaters wanted to actually process and like CGI or any of that stuff, if they wanted to process where the light is going to go, which is a dynamic process. It's not a static process, it's dynamic. They had to do that through software, and it took forever. But, you know, movies, right? They have years to make them and budgets out the wazoo, so whatever. So that kind of video production didn't come to games for, well, until recently, where NVIDIA invented a ray tracing core. And what that means is instead of the video processing transistors just processing a static signal, which means we get this information and we turn it into an image, and that's it. The RTX cores are capable of receiving basic information and turning it into a dynamic image. What that means is the information it's receiving can change significantly, and it's able to change the image and how that image is produced based on that, making it dynamic. That means I can walk into a scene and it can change multiple things in that scene based on the information that it's receiving, i.e. where the sun is or where the light source is what it's reflecting, what the surface is that it's reflecting off of, and the angles that the light is going to take, the angles and intensity that the light beam is going to take from source to reception. In a static environment, that has to be pre-programmed. And the CPU literally says, this is the image, and then the video card says, all right, here's your, here you go. Now, the computers are capable of saying, all right, here's the image, here's the light location, and here are the texture packages. And the ray tracing cores are able to take that information as it changes on the money, in real time. They're able to take that information and process the video, realistically producing what you would see as shadows, what you would see as, you know, like starbursts or bright spots, dust, you know, entering light streams type stuff. It's able to produce these images real time. So now we bring movie quality imagery into, you know, home-based processing units. Essentially, all that in a nutshell, right? All that in a little nutshell means that we can make significantly more awesome graphics. Number two reason, the amount of cores, processing cores that this video card has. Let's just look at it. There are 18.6 million transistors in the bloody thing. That's million, not thousand, million transistors. Gee golly, I mean the die is like pretty massive. Processor size 12 nanometer. That's actually smaller than the CPU. Turing, GPU name. So let's go into, there are 68 ray tracing cores. So there's 68 cores in there specifically designed to produce those ray traced images with the light sources and the shadows and everything in real time. That's the highest on the domestic market. If you get into Quadro cars and commercial series cards, they have more, but I don't feel like paying $3,000 for a video card, so whew. Features memory. We have 11 gigabytes of GDDR6, which is the latest and fanciest memory for this. That means it has 11 gigabytes of the fastest memory available for it to do its processing. In other words, the CPU feeds it the information, the CPU feeds it into the memory, and the ray tracing cores draw from the memory and then produce the image. So it's kind of a buffer thing. So there's more memory for it to buffer the processing. It makes everything faster, essentially. Oh, 250 watt TDP, so that's pretty hungry. Sorry, I'm reading this off here because I want to give you guys accurate information about these things. What is the other? There's tensor cores. Oh, here we go. 544. 544 tensor cores. What are tensor cores? Tensor cores are another another core, which is another series of transistors arranged in a very specific way for processing video. What does that mean and why does it benefit me? That means the video card with 544 tensor cores is able to reproduce images a lot faster. Now, mind you, reproducing images. What good is it to reproduce images faster? Well, if you're playing video games, that means I can run either larger images like 4K at like 60 frames a second. No big deal. Whereas older video cards or lesser video cards like a 2060 or a 1660 or AMD's video cards, screw that. You know, those might have a pretty hard time producing 4K because 4K is a lot of information per image. So with 544 tensor cores, this thing can say 4K 60. All right, cool. We're good with that. I have the processing power. There's another thing, and this brings me to reason number 2 of why I wanted this video card. Adobe uses CPU-based processing. I want to upgrade to DaVinci Resolve for my video editing. Now that's something I have to do slowly and I have to do carefully because it's relearning everything, and I'm not good at the video editing to begin with, so, you know, it's a learning process. But why do I want to use DaVinci Resolve? DaVinci Resolve is, I want to say, engineered for, I don't know if that's the right word, but DaVinci Resolve uses video cards to help processing, not just the CPU. So Adobe uses primarily CPU and can use the video card to help. DaVinci Resolve says, yo, there's a video card that's specifically there to process video. Use it. So using DaVinci Resolve should greatly enhance how fast the computer is able to render video, and having such a powerful video card in here should allow the program to be that much faster. So that program is what makes the biggest difference. Also, I want to run Minecraft with ray tracing, and I'm not going to do that with just any ordinary video card. So there. Yeah. So that wraps it up. Other than that, I mean, we talked about the power supply, which is unique and awesome, and what it's capable of doing in such a tiny little package. It's pretty cool. We talked about the memory, the cooling system. This is my... I didn't have the money to put the cooling system in that I wanted to in the first place. I ran out of money doing this crap, so this is the cooling system I had. Technically, it's overkill, but technically it's not. And I say that because the water block that's on the processor is fine. The radiator is way bigger than it needs to be. But the pump is that shitty Chinese choo-choo pump. I don't know about the pump. I think I'm going to upgrade the pump. But here's what I'm actually running into an issue here. So here's a negative for you. The 9900K, Intel is notorious for using bad thermal interface between the actual chip and the integrated heatsink, the IHS. The IHS is what you actually see. So if I take out, I can show you with this processor. This is the 8700K, which is still a very solid chip, by the way. Very solid chip. So on this processor, put this here, and this here. There we go. So that metal piece right there, this is the back. You can see all the little pads, the golden pads. This piece, that shiny piece right there, that's called the IHS, Integrated Heatsink. Underneath that is the actual chip, the silicon chip. Intel is really bad for using crappy thermal interface between the IHS and the actual chip. And what that amounts to is when I start hitting this processor, you know, for all it's worth, going 100%, the temperature very quickly climbs. And when I say very quickly, like it takes seconds for the temperature to climb high doing that. Maybe I want to put this in this way? Or no, this way. But when it relaxes, so when it stops rendering, like when it's rendering video, it pretty much hits it full bore. Which the temperature within seconds goes up into the 70s. That's Celsius. So 70 degrees Celsius is, well, it's way warmer than Fahrenheit. What is this? It's 1.8 plus 32. Fuck it, I don't want to do the math. But anyhow, it's hot. It's hotter than I want it to be. But when it turns off, it immediately drops back down to 35. Now what that tells me is, and those temperatures are read through software. Software is reading the actual die temperature. It's sensors built into the CPU die itself. It's underneath that thermal interface. So what that tells me is that there is cool metal available. The IHS is cool, so there is a cool surface available, right? So I have a cool surface here, and this piece is getting hot. If I can't transmit the heat fast enough, then when I add heat to the chip, it doesn't matter how cold the IHS is, it can't move it fast enough. This thermal interface becomes an insulator at that point, and that's what's happening. So I'm pretty sure that this chip would benefit the absolute most by delidding and changing that thermal interface to like a liquid metal, which is a gallium and mercury mix, I believe. It may not be mercury, so it's like a gallium mix. It's literally liquid metal interface, which should be significantly better. And what that means is the IHS and the chip itself actually make better contact, so I can transfer more heat. What I really want to do by the end of all this is actually create a heat sink, like water block heat sink, that connects directly to the die, so I eliminate two thermal interfaces. I eliminate one thermal interface. I still have to have the thermal interface between the chip and the actual heatsink. So that's the idea in the long run. But for now, the chip does heat up very quickly, but it cools down very quickly, which tells me that the chip itself needs a bit of adjusting. But overall, like I said, the thing is 4 times faster at doing the same job than my old computer, as well as significantly more capable when it comes to the graphics that it can process. I can run ray tracing games with no problem. Not that I have a monitor that's worth it. The monitor is quite literally over 12 years old. It's my original. It still works. 1080p. I mean, can't argue that. Actually, it's 1200. It's 1920 by 1200. I'm not sure how that falls out, but that's what it is. Yeah. So that's it, guys. I know that was a lot of information all at once. Now, I'm not even going to edit this video because I feel like we went through this fairly decently. So I apologize if it's a long video, if you felt like I was long-winded in all this, but I think it was pretty decent. So I thank you very much for watching thus far. Thank you for allowing me to actually go over and give a good representation of what this computer is actually physically, you know, what it is and what it's capable of. If you think I sound smart, it's just because I looked it up. I Googled it and then wrote it down so I could read it to you. I'm really not that smart, but you know what? Hey, this is what this is about. I thank you very much, guys, for watching. I really appreciate it. I know it's been a while with the videos and stuff. I've been getting caught up in some things. You know, work is a lot of it, and there's a lot of responsibilities and stuff. So I guess I'll apologize about that, but I'm going to try and get back on track. There's a lot of things to be done. So by all means, you know, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that bell icon. So hit the subscribe. Let's see, you're watching it. It's going to be right here, right there. The subscribe button. Hit it right there, and then the bell icon. Make sure that's clicked. Hit a like, a thumbs up on the video. Makes a massive difference to the videos. Like, seriously, the more thumbs up I can get, the better the video looks to YouTube and gets promoted and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, if you guys feel like I did not do a good representation of talking about what's going on here, then by all means, please let me know. Mention it in the comments. What did I get wrong? What did I get right? What could I improve? I love hearing that from you guys. I really appreciate any interaction. You can call me a dumbass in the comments if you want. I don't care. It's an interaction. We'll go with it. No publicity is bad publicity. Anyhow, I appreciate it, guys. I really do. Thank you very much. Have a good night. As always, I will see you in the next one.
Bye-bye.